Roots and Wings Roundtable on doctoral education that was actually postponed, as were. And so today we are very happy that SSWR, GADE, and Grand Challenges for Social Work, co-sponsoring this event. That is Mo Yi Lee. I'm PhD Program Director and Professor from College of Social Work at The Ohio State University. I'm also the past president of GADE, the group for the advancement for doctoral education in social work. A little context, COVID-19 and anti-racist uprising as a result of the murder of Mr. George Floyd and many other African-American and people of color due to police violence has unprecedented impact on our society. Now, while these two pandemics appear to be different, they actually both attest to the fact that systemic racism continues to be a grand challenge. And so GADE, in the 2016 strategic plan, clearly described the mission for doctoral education is to prepare the next generation of scholar, researcher, and educator to function as steward of the discipline. So how to prepare the next generation of social work scholar to decolonize and to decenter whiteness in social work research and create an environment for inclusive social work research is just our ethical responsibility. So the best hope for today's seminar is to collaboratively generate a useful dialogue about how we are able to prepare our students, to do that across various stages, of their career. So today's agenda, at the beginning, we will invite our panelists to share with us how they would define anti-racist and inclusive research mentoring. You have used this term a lot, but I'm not quite sure whether we have a clear and also shared understanding about the core components or characteristics. How do we know when we are actually doing it? So our panelists will share the perspective and also experience with us. And we will have an open dialogue for around 40 minutes. And on the topics, but not limited to the following, maybe about the needs of the doctoral student, the mental health, mentoring practice that are helpful, and actually how can faculty support each other to expand our own capacity to engage in anti-racist and inclusive mentoring. And how about the institutional effort and practice that support? And also about the political context that we are all in. At least one state already have a proposed legislation that they will fire tenure-track faculty if, they speak about tenets of critical race theory. So this is just something that we just cannot avoid. To wrap up, we will invite our panelists to share with us the best hope and also the next step. With this, I'm very proud and happy to share and introduce our panelists with all of you. They are also passionate about, anti-racist and inclusive mentoring, and they have really valuable experience to share with us. So Michael Spencer, Presidential Term Professor from the School of Social Work, University of Washington. He's also on the Grand Challenge Social Work Executive Committee. Jenny Jones, Dean and Professor, Whitney M. Young Jr., School of Social Work, Clark Atlanta University. Mattel Teasley, Interim Senior Vice Provost of Academic Affairs and Provost, Dean and Professor at the College of Social Work, University of Utah. He's also the president of NED and also, with Grand Challenges for Social Work. Haek-Yong Ham, Chair of Social Research and Professor, Boston University School of Social Work. And also Kamala Alcantara, Associate Professor and Associate Dean for Doctoral Education, School of Social Work, Columbia University. And last but not the least, I'm very happy to introduce my co-moderator, Daniel Huckman. He's actually from the Suzanne Wakwak School of Social Work, University of South California. With this, I would like to start, the conversation. And so at the beginning, I would like to invite our panelists to start, sharing. Mike, do you want to go first?
Sure, thank you so much. And what I'll try to do here is to help set the stage for our conversations for those panelists that come after me and for our dialogue that's to come. I'll be sharing my screen. All right. So let me start off by just sort of talking about one of the, for me at least, one of the most important components of anti-racist mentorship, and that is really the relationship itself. You know, for me, a lot of this work is very relational, and that, you know, we have to remember that within these relationships, these mentoring relationships, that they are subject to the very same social forces and interpersonal dynamics that are a part of all of our human relationships. And just as, you know, we as social workers sort of teach our students and practice in our profession, it really does require us to do some self-reflection, not only around ourselves, but around the power differences and the identity assumptions that often come with these complex social relationships in which we all generally exist within. Now, you know, because we're a bunch of social work researchers, I wanted to present you with some data here for us to sort of review and think about a little bit more. So to start off with, here's a little bit of data from our own doctoral students at the University of Washington here, where they were asked what they thought were the characteristics of effective mentoring. And like, you know, like many programs across the US, doctoral programs across the US, many of our students are students of color. And many of them are being mentored in many cases across racial lines, within and across racial lines. So it's quite interesting to sort of note some of the observations that students and faculty have had. So here's some of the student responses, you know, welcoming, encouraging, realistic, transparent, professional, view me as a future colleague, and, you know, particularly here within the School of Social Work, you know, someone who is committed to social justice issues, to higher causes, to combating racism and other forms of oppression. So, you know, students are looking for not only just mentorship, but role models for those that address social justice within academia. What we've seen as some of the negative experiences that doctoral students have had is where mentors have been closed-minded, not so interested in getting to know them, not understanding some of their unique challenges, either as a working parent, as a person of color, as a woman, or person who is of a different gender, people with disabilities, etc. Oftentimes, these mentors can also be insensitive in their own lack of professionalism, unencouraging, people who focus on failure rather than success. So, you know, I think many of us have been mentored throughout our careers and have had both the positive and negative experiences that you see from students. And now let's look at some of the faculty responses here. The faculty responses for effective mentoring relationships. So students who are characterized by curiosity, flexibility, openness to critical feedback, intellectually hungry, committed to making the best possible revisions in any work, not just doing the minimal amount of work, coming to their meetings with an agenda. This is what I said I would do. This is what you're able to do. These are the major issues that I'd like to talk about. So as you can see, very, you know, very different from those of the student. And, you know, I mean, if I were to sort of look at these relationships, I would view them not only different in terms of content, but, you know, potentially even culturally, right? So some observations, you know, how do these experiences match up with your own reflections of mentorship? How do they differ with regards to your unique experiences and your own social identities? And how do they match up with your experiences as a mentor, as well as a mentee? So I'll stop sharing for the moment and, you know, sort of use that as a way for us to sort of self-reflect and to think about our own positionality within academia, both in terms of our role as mentors and mentees. I'd like for us to think about these issues intersectionally, but at the same time, you know, as we are here today, focused on anti-racism, I'd like for us to spend, some time engaging in some deep work around what does it mean to promote anti-racism within these mentoring relationships. So with that, I'll turn the floor back over to our panel.
Thank you, Mike. For sharing with us, that is really, really very helpful. Hey, Jenny, you want to go next?
Thank you, Michael. As I was listening to you call out those various points, I kind of started to reflect back to my own doctoral program days. And that's been many, many years ago. But I think the importance of what you put up there on the screen and talked about still resonates today, probably even more so. I do think it's important that doctoral students have effective mentoring, but that effective mentoring oftentimes does not occur for them with people that necessarily look like them or people that necessarily understand their plight. And I think that that's something we have to start to really think about. And when we're talking about anti-racist mentoring, one of the points I wanted to make as I was listening to Michael talk is that I think today we use the term anti-racism so frequently, and I think people sometimes confuse it with diversity, equity, and inclusion. Oh, they'll say, oh, it's just the same, and it's not the same. I think it's very important that we understand that it's not the same. When we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we're talking about support, resources, those kinds of things. But we're talking about when we're talking about anti-racism, for me, it's about systemic change being made. It's about looking at that system and making change to that system so that we don't have to necessarily be so concerned about, however we identify people this here, that we're doing it from a systemic standpoint. And that means we're looking at everyone and we're being inclusive and we understand what that looks like, particularly at the university level. I just think about, again, my own experience, and I wish this was something we would have been talking about practicing 25 years ago when I started out. Even when I think about my first faculty position as a young, new early career faculty person at a research institution, there were very few people that looked like me. That's number one, very few. And the thought of the mentorship piece came about through assigned mentors, not mentors that I selected or I thought would be a good fit for me. And again, they didn't look like me. And when I think about it now, I think they probably thought they were doing the best that they could and doing a good job, but they didn't really even understand or know me. They never really got to know who I am. They just kind of saw that, well, she's interested in child welfare. We do child welfare, that will work. Not understanding the totality of that, because my experiences in child welfare as a practitioner, as a scholar, that was a part of my dissertation work, was very different from the experience that they were sharing with me around research, around writing, publications. And so, and they were not the only ones. They were lovely people, but they were not the only ones that was operating from that standpoint. So that's why I think it's so important now that we have these discussions about anti-racist mentoring, anti-racism, period, as we think about the academy, because we can't just think that we're in to throw a few resources over here, hire a few faculty of color, and we're in the game, because that is not the case. We really got to think about systemic change and how do we make that change so that it will be everlasting.
Thank you, Jenny. Sharing with us, really, about, we don't want to mix up anti-racist, with, DEI, because it's actually So I think that is a really important highlight. Yeah.
Mhm.
Chris, do you want to share your thoughts with us?
Yes. So I want to start with a story because I like to tell the story. So my neighborhood, my neighbor's son, it's my neighbor's son's story. And my neighbor's son is 15 years old. He is an Asian American boy. And one day he was on the street with his friends. And then the one guy who was found out that he was 18 years old, he approached to him, to my neighbor's son, and he said, "Hey, Ching Chong, why don't you come? And I want to fight with you." So I know Ching Chong is a very derogatory word for Asian Americans, right? So this boy, 15 years old boy, he got so mad, and he's very athletic and very strong and tall. He started punching the other guy and punching him so hard, and his fist was bleeding. And the other boy, who is white boy, is 17, he said, "Stop, stop. Hey, stop it. I'm not a racist." Okay. The reason why I'm saying this is that there's nobody in this country who would admit that they are racist.
Mhm.
No matter what they do, no matter what they say, I am not racist. The reason why is that people's understanding of racist is something permanent. Something is an identity, okay? And it's something that, I am a good person, so I cannot be racist. That is the definition of the racist, okay? Therefore, not being racist is not good enough because everybody will deny that they are racist. Therefore, what we need to use is anti-racist, okay? This is why we have to be anti-racist. If you don't want to be a racist, the opposite term is anti-racist. Now, according to Dr. Ibram Kendi, who is my colleague at Boston University, he reframed the concept of racism and anti-racism. And according to him, racism is defined as a collection of the racist policies that lead to racial inequity and that is maintained or substantiated by the racist ideas. So just like Dr. Jones pointed out, it is a system that we are talking about. Rather than group or the individual, we need to focus on system, otherwise nothing will change. That is his emphasis. So now, we are talking about the definition of anti-racism or anti-racist mentoring, right? So I want to share my definition of anti-racist mentoring. So I think that there are 4 components. The first is examining the current policy in your institution. So what that means is that we need to first examine or investigate the institutional policy within the academia that perpetuates racial inequity. For instance, for the doctoral students, okay? Is there any evidence of the racial inequity in terms of the admission and the length of graduation for the doctoral students, or the number of publications based on the races? And for faculties, is there any evidence that racial inequity in terms of the recruitment and the retention of the people of color? We need to know the facts. So let's start from the evidence. That's number 1. Number 2, once we have evidences, we need to reflect those evidence. Is there an evidence of inequity? And if so, let's have a discussion on why, okay? Could it be because of the institutional climate? Could it be because of our review on promotional process? Or could it be because of the marginalization of the research or lack of mentoring? Or is it because of the overt or covert discrimination onto this individual? Number 3 is having the growth mindset, okay? Growth mindset. So we need to have the good and humble mindsets to reach and grow to be anti-racist mentors. In fact, being anti-racist is a dynamic process. As I said, it's not a permanent, right? Being racist or anti-racist is not permanent, because it means that we can be racist or we can be anti-racist depending on what we are saying and what we are doing at given moment. It's very important concept. Finally, we need to spend time on challenging and eventually transforming the policy and practices. We need to constantly think about this. How can I be part of the struggle? And how can I help to end the policy and replace them with an anti-racist policy within my institution? Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, Chris, that is really, really very thoughtful, and you outlined very clearly, the components, and that is so helpful. Yes. And yeah, next I would like to invite Camilla.
Yeah, well, thank you. And, thank you to GADE and to SWR for facilitating this dialogue. It's really great to hear my colleagues' perspectives. And I think some of the points that I was going to raise have been mentioned, but I'll sort of underscore, I think that it's really important to differentiate sort of mentoring or sort of mentoring across difference or mentoring centering diversity, equity, inclusion from anti-racist mentoring, which is part of what I think Dr. Jones had started to talk about. And I really, I completely agree. I think the term anti-racist, anti-racism is often used and not defined. And so I think in the context of mentoring, specifically in mentoring research and scientists, part of an essential component of that is I think centering, dismantling structural racism within science. That's part of the charge of, I think, training and sort of mentoring researchers is sort of mentoring and, well, how do you then dismantle structural racism in science? That's part of it. And thinking about the entire scientific academic enterprise, from conducting the research to reporting the research to reviewing the research to disseminating the research to really create that systemic change that we had, I think, started to talk about and really agree with this. So I sort of see it as a lens. I see it as an approach and not necessarily a destination for some of the reasons that were raised before. And I think the other second component is just a sense of mutual responsibility, right? So we all have a shared responsibility to adopt this anti-racist lens in our research, in our mentoring. And so it's not really a responsibility of those who carry marginalized identities, minoritized identities, but really it becomes a collective and shared responsibility. And I think when I think over the course of my training, I think early on, a lot of the models were, and I felt like I was lucky, sort of I trained at a place where I had excellent role models, not as many, but still sort of excellent in terms of BIPOC scholars who were invested in mentoring folks who carried marginalized identities like I do. But what I think what's shifting is this sense of, well, how do you resist, right? How do you resist and how do you work towards dismantling structural racism? I think that's a clear sort of shift in the practices, certainly when I was training to what I'm observing now.
Thank you so much. For our panelists, actually, Dr. Mattel Teasley, we just met him actually even ago, but oh my goodness, Mattel, you come right in time. Hi, Mattel.
Hello, how are you? How is everyone?
Thank you. We it's just so timely because the other four panelists, already share their thoughts about defining anti-racist and inclusive mentoring, research mentoring, and also the experience. So please, you come right in time to share with us your thoughts.
Well, I was trying to avoid the whole thing. That was part of the delay, but okay, here we go. Thank you, everyone. I had a little Zoom problem there. I'm Martell Teasley, Interim Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs, better known as the Provost. So in terms of anti-racism, and I haven't heard the dialogue, we're really talking about policies or practices in terms of opposing racism and promoting racial equality and equity. And that's something that everyone can do. I think for me, the bigger challenge for that is our understanding of racism and our conceptualization of racism. And so I think also we need to understand what I refer to as the centrality of race and racism, which consists of how one views, investigates, and examines the structural system, its operations and actions, including the cultural context, and the ability to pinpoint the ripple effects of problems grounded in racialized policies and practices. So it's important to understand that although race and racism were central factors throughout the development and maintenance of the American experience, they have been relegated to the margins or peripheral of our discourse on causal factors to explain racial group socioeconomic disparities and outcome and racialized behaviors. In a proposed colorblind society, race is not a factor, and at worst is conceived of as a marginal factor. That is, racism as a happenstance. It just happened to happen here and there, but we don't live in a racist society. That's a racist individual. On the other hand, people will say, I'm not a racist, there's a bigger structural system and it's beyond me. So we have this situation where no one wants to take culpability, not the society itself and not individuals. I think I've heard someone say that no one really likes being labeled a racist. So although there are times when race really is a marginal factor, the fact that many in our society are uninformed and unaware of how race and racism work as a central factor and the functionality of really what we should really see as a historical caste system hinders our ability to create anti-racist practices within our society. And my point there is that the whole notion of a racist society is foregone because of the normalization of race, or what I refer to as racial common sense thinking. That is how we make sense of race. And so in this whole notion of the great chain of beings, and this notion of the place and positionality of people within society, notions of beauty, our notions of good, bad, right, and wrong, our notions of intellect, are all really grounded in race. And so we really have to unpeel that or unpack that before we can get to this notion of anti-racism in our society. So in terms of some concrete examples, I was talking to someone the other day who said, well, it's a problem with Black people. They can be the fire chief, the police chief, the mayor, nothing changes. Well, I said there are two basic problems there. One, there's a wide gulf between color and consciousness, as counseling psychologist Thomas Parham has said. In other words, there's some people who are genetically dark and have a lot of melanin in their pigmentation, but have strange minds and may not think Black. And there may be folk of different hue who we call white, who may get it. And so that doesn't mean that so when we have Black people who run cities and run organizations and major institutions, they may not get it. And then the whole notion is the structure itself. And so while we put people in positions, and believe me, as the first African-American provost to sit in this seat, I hide a bit from students about how I can, why don't you change this? Why don't you change that? Well, I'm still swimming upstream myself in terms of dealing with a lot of this. And so the whole notion of this inclusive racism really means telling the entire story. In other words, what W. Du Bois meant when he said, an education is not only just for earning a living, but it's also for living a life. And so we just don't need to train people to be social work professionals, PhD students, and understand race, but how racism impacts our entire lifestyle in terms of who we are and how we identify. And the first part of that is our own identity of who we are and what we should be doing. And that, we take that for granted, but I see many people who are really hamstrung by that very understanding of who they are as a racialized individual. Also, racism morphs, it changes from time to time. And so the kind of overt racism that we have in the past is quite different than what we're seeing today. So one scratches their head about what's really going on. So we have to have, and my central point is that we have to have an in-depth understanding of how race and racism are conceptualized before we can get to anti-racist practices. And that takes some doing because we think we don't necessarily have to study it. People think because we are people of African descent or quote unquote people of color that we get it in terms of racism. Now, there's a huge folly there in terms of this notion of people of color, because the whole notion of people of color racializes people. It separates them from that class called whiteness. They're outside of race. All the rest of us are racialized. And so that very conceptualization there we have to deal with. So I don't really like that term, people of color. I don't like the whole term BIPOC. We need to call, I know that works as a nomenclature, but again, it sets our Anglo-American brothers and sisters outside of the rest of us. And that was what was set into motion with the whole notion of the great chain of beings. I'm going to stop right there because I don't want to take too much time. Okay.
Thank you so much, Mattel. That is so thoughtful. Like, challenge us to think, even the term BIPOC,
Yeah.
I just think there's a lot of things we need to digest. But anyway, right now, I think Daniel, we can probably start the open dialogue.
Well, thank you very much for all of these really important reflections that really prompt a lot of deep thinking for all of us. We're now going to transition in terms of the webinar to an open dialogue amongst the panelists and also engagement with kind of questions and comments from the rest of the participants engaging as well. So you can put your questions into the Q&A box as well. And just to start the dialogue, I really wanted to start off to prompt the panel to kind of highlight any emergent themes or key challenges for wrestling both conceptually and establishing definitions that lead to action downstream. So I wanted to turn back to the initial reflections of the panel.
We're all digesting.
Yeah. I just took a look at the question chat in terms of addressing social work literature, recreative oppressive structures in the classroom. Again, for me, it's that lack of understanding of what racism really is. We're doing well, and we haven't had an in-depth study of that. Now, this whole notion of white fear and wokeness, if you're a Black male, you can't be asleep in this society in the first place. It reminds me, and I don't want to step on any toes when folk were talking about being born again, that I haven't died yet. So this whole notion of being woke, understanding of who we are. But for Black folk in general, you have to be grounded in right off top. And so part of this, and I think what the person is getting at, is really the understanding of whiteness and the discourse on whiteness. Because when it comes to racism, we look for Black and brown and other people of indigenous hues to talk about it, when indeed the problem is white supremacy itself and white solidarity. We don't really understand white solidarity. So it's just as much as we have feminist whites who are opposed to anything that white men do, they actually in droves voted for Donald Trump. That's a form of white solidarity. And to stop right there on that.
Yeah. And actually the question, I think is helpful, maybe Daniel, I can share the question. So to see, the panelists, the responses. Basically, it's that a factor that is not addressed in social work literature is how we, as educators, recreate oppressive structure in our classroom through attending to white tears, vigilantes, white male self-appointed authority and great invasion, like, to please entitlement and then maintain enrollment. So how is doctoral education attempting to address these widespread like problems? I mean, education. So, yeah, that is the question, original question.
Well, I'll build a little bit off of what Martel said, because I agree with every single thing that he said. And also want to add that I think that, I think that also then puts, in terms of the burden of like, how does this all get changed, right? I mean, we've got a full person of color panel here, which I appreciate, but, I mean, guess what? We are doing the work. We've been doing this work. I have evidence on my CV. I've been doing it for about 30 years. I mean, and it's hard work. And, I mean, everything else that we have to do, including being the provost here, I mean, we have to do all of that too, and so, where is the burden of, who needs to make some change, and I mean, I'm not saying that a certain group needs to do it alone. We all need to do it, going back to Martel's sort of notion of, our common destinies and our common goals, I mean, which we all have as members of this institution. I think as professional social workers, as people who ascribe to those tenets, we all need to take that responsibility. And what does that mean, right? What that means is, not just understanding the structural, ways in which people are oppressed, but actively doing something about it, right? And doing something about it, I would say at the very least in your mentoring relationship, right? So what does that mean? That means being very open to the fact that your student experience may be very, very different from yours. And it may not just be empathy that they're looking for, but actual ways that you can provide some ways to make a difference in that individual's lives, and that can be, in many cases, as we know, as many of us know, difference between getting a degree and not getting the degree. So I'll just stop there. Yeah.
Michael, your points are very, very well taken. I think we have to be honest. And I also think some self-reflection for ourselves to really look at the situation and then be able to call things out that we see happen in our institutions. Institutions do a lot of good, but they also do some things that are not so good. And when we witness those things, we have to call it out and help folks think about making a change in that way, because if we don't, we just perpetuate that cycle and it just kind of continues on. And then we see the result of that a lot of times is our students. And, when students will be at these institutions and they struggle to get through, or maybe the struggle was not apparent to the folk working in the institution, but internally they struggle to get through. They get through and then they never hear from them anymore. Why is that? We got to think about those kinds of things, because the struggle that they had the struggle that they endured trying to get through was so painful that they don't want to relive that. So they just totally disconnect. And I think we do a disservice by pretending that that doesn't happen. I think that whole, we will witness our colleagues present a situation from that deficit thinking and not say anything. When in fact, I think we need to make some point about that. I remember at one of the schools I was at, and we were talking about some faculty candidates, and everybody was kind of sharing their thoughts about the candidate, and someone said, well, it just wasn't a qualified pool. It was just not a qualified pool. Well, what I've learned over the years, I was very young and green. What I've learned over the years, that when people say that, that's a euphemism of saying, it was, they handle qualified Black people, and that's just not okay. And I think we have to call those things out and try to help change that system, because like I said from the beginning, this is a systemic issue. This is not an individual. We're not trying to change individual people. We're trying to change the system so that it will be more conducive and fair and open to people, Black people, Asian people, Korean people, Hispanic people, all people of color. And that's a real life, that's a real issue. I think oftentimes we try to think if we can just confront that one colleague that changes the system, and it's not just that one colleague, it's multiple colleagues. It's a system that is supported those colleagues to be that way.
Mm-hmm. I just want to add one more example. So when we were evaluating some of our colleagues, one of the colleagues said that, oh, this particular person, didn't really have any evidence of being an editorial board membership. How come maybe there's just one board membership, and then it was a person of color. So no one was challenging that comment because it is what it is, right? Mm-hmm. But then I said, you know what? Let's think about how you can become a board member. You need to have friends who are in board. You need to know a lot of people. And who are in the board, actually, majority of them are white people. And there's a white solidarity, which you just talked about, right? They help each other. They make a phone call. Hey, there's one membership space here. You want to join? Yeah, of course. But if no one calls you, no one emails you to tell you about this membership, how can you get into that track? There's just one of the example. But people in academia don't even think about it in general, okay? In general, not everybody. But then you cannot be quiet. You have to say, hey, you know what? It's not about how great scholar you are, joining the board membership. It's about the social network that you have. And it happens to be, you need to be a white person to have a big network in academia. So.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to, before we transition, I think I just wanted to add to, and this was already alluded to, but it's not, it's not going to be one program. It's not going to be addressing sort of one faculty member. This is, it's a long game, right? You're playing the long game of trying to achieve, racial equity. And so, what that means is that it's a process, and it's going to get messy, and it's going to involve, I think, consistent pressure, for lack of a better word, as opposed to, yes, we're going to institute that one program that's going to lead to, going to have these outcomes in all these different areas. And I think particularly, when we're serving in roles of administration, you're sort of working towards those metrics, but it's not, you're not going to easily get there with one program. So just sort of highlighting how complex it is and how it really does take this long-term commitment and constant pressure across an entire school department sort of unit, I think, and buy-in, across the board. So it is, challenging, but obviously worthwhile.
But I agree with you, Camilla, because I think that's a part of the doctoral education that we're going to have to emphasize. The fight is going to be long, and it is a chronic structural issue. And when you are fighting, you are going to be disappointed. You're going to want to give up. You're going to want to leave academia. But then you cannot give up, because if you give up, then there's going to be a impact in the field, in this particular field that you're studying. You cannot give up. And I think that it's so important for us to let them know that what they're fighting for, the expectation, because they cannot be rosy, like I'm passionate about what I'm doing, but that passion, you're going to be hit very, very hard, you're going to be so disappointed. You're going to be encountering a lot of failures. It's not because of who you are. It's because of the structural issue. It's because of the racist society that we are living.
What our two colleagues just described is really the meaning of struggle. So when people say in struggle, that's what they mean, because it's a longitudinal process. As the freedom fighter, Ghanaian freedom fighter Anna Carol Cabral said, the struggle for victory in anti-racist practice is long and hard. Therefore, amass no easy victories and claim no easy victories and tell no lies to the people.
You know, I'm also, another thing I'm sort of hearing is that, you know, there's, and I guess what makes it the long game is that there's a big P policy and there's a small p policy, right? And we can change that big P, but you know, the small p is the social networks, right? It's that white solidarity, it's the white supremacist system that people aren't even thinking about in terms of big P policy, because it's just a part of normal everyday life. It's just, I wake up, I go about my business. My business happens to be with a certain group of people who think and live in the same neighborhood and who I can relate to. And that's how, I mean, how are we going to change that P, right? How are we going to change that informal structure, even when we change, you know, you have to change that. Otherwise the big P, you know, might be hard to change.
So this is a really interesting point that touches on one of the questions coming up from the Q&A around your experiences with success and or failures and challenges in establishing structures or policies with rewards and accountability for incorporating anti-racist perspectives. I think potentially we could maybe even add to that this question of structures or policy with the big P and the little p, as you said, Dr. Spencer. So that's one of the comments from the chat that would be interested in your reflections.
I think, Daniel, that that's a pretty big question, and there is no quick, easy answer for that. I just think that we have to always be conscious of those situations when they occur. We have to also acknowledge them and talk about them, speak about them. I think one of the biggest things that happens is that we see this stuff and we say nothing, or we say that, that doesn't affect me, and we kind of move on. I've seen that happen in the academy oftentimes. And I think that we have to we have to address it. And how that gets addressed is a much larger question, but it certainly has to be addressed. And it's not going to happen in a one-shot meeting or one-time calling out your colleague. It's not going to happen. You got to be thoughtful. And I really believe for the change to occur, it has to be intentional. I was at a meeting a few weeks, about a month ago, and some of these very same issues that come up around, the issues around race and those kinds of things. And we were talking about some of the deans were asking about, how do we go about doing this? What do this needs to look like? And the comment was made, we've been talking about this for a long time. And I think it's done when it's intentional. It's not something you think of overnight and say, oh, we're going to change my school. No, it's an intentional process where you've given some thought to it and you really have laid out some plans and you really are committed to working with this through the long haul, not just putting something down for now. And I know some schools, I know some deans that have done some really great work around that. And it's because they were intentional about this. It wasn't just to get more brownie points. It wasn't just to get more students of color, it was because it's the right thing to do, and it's a system they were willing to challenge to make it better for all.
Yeah, well stated, Jenny. I think in terms of this change of the BIP process, and I've had some experience about it, and so we do have to be extremely intentional. We also have to institutionalize what we do. And so my experience at academic institutions is, I take things on. I remember my time at Florida State. I took on lots of things there, but as soon as I left, they destroyed all of it. The students called me and said, Dr. Teasley, all the programs you started, they got rid of. And so one of the first lessons there was they were not institutionalized. So what I've been doing here when I was the Dean of the College of Social Work was try to institutionalize, routinize diversity, equity, and inclusion. So just as we have a promotion and tenure process takes place, it has some rules to it of engagement. If people leave, it's still in place. The bodies tinker with it every now and then. When we look at EDI, we should have the same thing in terms of our curriculum, in terms of our hiring practices, in terms of how students are treated. So what I set up is a climate survey that is taken every 2 years. That's fed to certain committees. We look at the recruitment process. We look at the curriculum itself, and we reify that over time. And that is, so when I leave the institution, another dean could certainly move away from that. But that is an attempt to institutionalize that in social work. If I have my way as provost, we would start to institutionalize that across the university.
So I think actually, this very much related to the next question, which is from a student. And so the question is, how can we as students challenge our administration to change the curriculum at the institution to become more culturally inclusive? So I think it connected to some of the, that Jenny and Mattel you already sharing.
I'll sort of jump in to say that at Columbia, certainly students have been key drivers of systemic change at our institution on lots of different levels, particularly related to curriculum. So as students, it's true in terms of if you think about the power structure within academia and that students occupy, positions of less power, but there are circumstances where students actually possess a lot of power. And I think sometimes that gets underestimated. And again, I think it is a longer game, it takes sort of coalition building and students across cohorts and years to achieve that kind of change. But I just sort of want to emphasize, particularly given Columbia's experience across, different issues, that students have been key drivers of that. It may not be that you see the change while you are a student within your funded period, but again, I think if those cross sort of year student collaborations are there and there's that pressure, there will be change that comes. So I just wanted to sort of jump in as someone at an institution where we've seen a lot of that evidence of that, and that's clearly improved the experience for our students and, more generally Columbia as an institution.
That's an excellent point. I think students oftentimes have more power than they think because they are a student. They don't believe they can make change. But you certainly can. It's just like she just stated that before me. You can be some drivers of that curricular change. You just have to stick together, band together. You may not see it then, but the cohort or two behind you will see it. And so that then it becomes that goes back to that systemic issue I was talking about. So then it becomes you're making systemic change that's going to be long lasting versus kind of quick, fast, irrational change. And then everything goes back to the way it was. And I think that same thing probably could apply to junior faculty. When they come in and they're faced with all of this newness and not real sure which way to go. I think that, well, it's hard if it's one new faculty by themselves coming into an institution. And I've always thought that was such a horrible thing to do, to hire one person of color by themselves coming into a new faculty. And you start just from the ground, not bottom, I mean under the ground, and it's really hard to make that change. But I think again, if we can think about this from a collective standpoint, we can certainly you can impact change as doctoral students. I've seen it happen, and the experience about Columbia is one that you can testify to.
Yeah, I will just continue to testify that students do have a lot of power.
They do.
to change.
They do.
They do listen to, we do listen to students, and but here's the thing, right? It shouldn't have to come to that, right? It really shouldn't have to come to that. We should really be more proactive in this avenue, because obviously that's why we're having this webinar, because it's needed, because students are already asking for it, and we know that they're asking for it. I actually, when soon after Kennedy's book came out, and anti-racism became part of everyday life. I pulled out the first paper I ever published, solo paper I ever published. It was on the difference between multiculturalism and anti-racism, and I said, it's about time. It's about time, right? So, we make progress, right? We do make progress over time, but we've been asking for this for a long time, and many of us, here, on this panel are administrators, and there's a reason why people ask us, why in the world would you want to take on this job, and why? It's because we can change structures within these kinds of positions, in ways that we can't, and we come in with that agenda, and I think that, again, but it can't be just us, right? It has to be a collective effort. This has to come from actually the majority. The desire to change mainstream has to come from the mainstream. We're operating at the margins, and we're going to continue to push towards center within our individual classrooms, within our individual relationships, within our individual schools. But even we still operate within a structure, right? If you're a dean, you've got, I'm an associate dean, you got to deal with a dean. You're a dean, you got to deal with a provost. You got a provost, you got to deal with a president, then you got to deal with the board of regents, right? So, there's always a hierarchy, and there's always a power structure involved. And so, it has to be collective. Otherwise, there's no way we're going to make that, the change that we need to make, right?
Right. And also, I just want to add one more thing about, in continuation of Mike's point, that we need to make changes, right? But I think when we are making changes, we need to focus on the outcomes. Really, our mind and evidence should be gathering the outcomes. So I see the question directly toward me. Shantai Tarver said, Dr. Ram, how would you advise doctoral students to register the institutional gatekeeping that occurred through the racialized networking, white networking? So that one is too, we need to be a scientist, like have an investigative mindset, okay? Because the white networking, so what if there's white networking? Like, we have Asian networking too, right? We have black networking too. I mean, we should have networking. That is not a problem, but it is a problem when that continuous networking oppresses the other racialized group, okay? Or it affects the outcomes of our success, or it creates the inequality, and it creates inequity over and over again. That is the problem, and that is the point that we're going to have to focus on. So that's the outcome. So I think we should constantly try to think about how our behaviors, how racialized groups' behaviors are affecting or being affected by the practice, by the behavior, by the network of the certain group.
You know, just a couple of words for students, and it said students have a lot more power. I took advantage of that power when I was a student, but I don't have time to tell those stories. But I would just say organize, collaborate, and strategize. And you have to organize and get your thoughts. I remember Dean walking out one day when we were protesting, and I went to his office, and he said, "Martell, all you guys were just doing was protesting, and you didn't have any solutions." I said to myself, we're never going to meet with the dean again without solution. And you have to collaborate. There are other groups on campus. So there are gay and lesbian brothers and transgender brothers and sisters, the feminists, women, Asian Americans, Hispanic, Latinx brothers and sisters. All of us are asking for something better than the status quo. And so those things we have to organize and goal set and stick to it and strategize.
Yeah.
And I do, as a dean, I can say that some of these discussions are taking place in schools of social work with deans. I was very impressed with the dean's meeting we had a few weeks ago, about a month ago, with all the deans and directors that were present at that meeting. We had some really hard conversations, hard discussions about all of this. And I think it would be, for any dean now, today, in today's world, not pay attention to these things, likely will not be a dean for a very long time. And that's real talk, because we're not the only ones just having this conversation. And these are the types of conversations that are taking place across the academy, across the country. And so people are, I think it would behoove any dean that plans to be around to take note of these discussions and start to come up with some type of strategies or plan to keep their school moving in the right direction, and to keep their students and faculty on point.
Yeah.
So there's a question in the chat that I think relates to these themes a lot, in terms of struggling through disconnect or challenges based on these institutional experiences, based on the structural systemic racism within institutions, and that has an effect, and it can even have an effect in terms of kind of institutional trauma for students. And so how in terms of kind of mentors, what can mentors do to support doctoral students and early career professionals in that context, and to heal from some of the traumas that can result from engaging with racist institutions?
You know, that's a tough question and a real one. I have met many people who have been traumatized from race, and they need to heal, just like PTSD. They need to work on it. And we have to realize when we have been traumatized from race. And I've been at institutions where it has affected me. And I've given, lots of people call me for advice, And one thing I always say is, you're responsible for your career. Nothing worse than woe is me. But that means leaving sometime. Then I found myself wounded for some things that happened and had to take my own advice. So that's really tough. But I would also say Ruth King writes a book called Mindful of Race, and she talks about the trauma of racism in there. When we're traumatized from race, or if we've got COVID and we're trying to help people as an analogy, we can't really help that much until we heal ourselves. And the first thing is the understanding that we have been traumatized from race. I went to war. I lived in the Saudi desert for a year. Thought it had no impact on me until one day when I was moving, I picked up a photo album of that war and my hand started trembling. I understood the impact that going to war had on me. So there's a lot of trauma out there, and that's a real tough thing to deal with. But where are the counselors on, trauma, working with people who have been traumatized because of racism?
And thank you for this very thoughtful, like, yeah, the historic trauma is a real thing, like, and Mattel, thank you for sharing the story as well. There's two questions actually for you, Mattel, in the chat. And one is like, you mentioned the criticism you received to change the system as you're swimming upstream yourself. And how do you balance that in your mentoring? Yeah.
Real, keeping it real with mentors. And while I can't tell them every time real things that I'm experiencing, I analogize them. And I tell them other stories that have similar meaning. But when I can, I let mentees know this is what's going on. This is what I'm dealing with in this position. And this is how racism works at this level. That's important so that people understand that it's at every, so it's not like, you're in the provost's office and it's all powerful and racism is over now because you're the decision maker. No. It comes trotting out every day. And so in some form or fashion. And so, how do I organize in this position? How do I collaborate? And how do I strategize? So we have to talk to students about those things too.
Thank you, Mattel.
An additional question has come in about not just, I think, PhD education, but also especially PhD education in the context of a focus on mentorship for anti-racist and inclusive research in the current political climate and in the current political climate around discussions around critical race theory as potentially maybe one example.
The only thing that I'll say is if your states are, currently looking at legislation around this to, it's likely going to be at the elementary and public school level right now, to get involved with that work. Because, if they're successful there, it will come up and move into higher ed. Right now, there's not a whole lot of movement in higher ed. The focus is on primary education, but it will, and so I would say, the more we can do at that level as social workers.
It's definitely coming, Michael. As you said, it's starting out in the public school, elementary schools, but I can assure you that it's coming. And we need to start preparing and thinking now about how to address that because it's gonna come.
And I think I actually mentioned like earlier, at least one state that's already like, proposed legislation to fire, tenure track for them to talk about like, critical race theory. So that is something that is very real, like, and so, but clearly, like, my suggestion, like, how we're able to get on and be an advocate, what we need to do, like, to advocate for the other side, is so important. Yeah. But there's actually one very important question also I want to make sure, like, we get to it. So the question is like, a lot of the research is deficit-based, considering race and reinforcing racism. So how can mentors help students push back against these popular theories, when it might be critical, like, to the mentees research?
Not sure I understood the question.
Okay, so maybe I say it again. A lot of the theories that we use right now, actually, like just deficit-based, when they're considering race. Maybe whatever group of people, like, they, so the question is more about how, like, as mentor, we are able to support students to put against these like theories when they're conducting their research.
That's good. That takes a lot of homework. You know, I mentor people, and one of the things I discovered about mentoring, people love to hear me talk, but you have to study.
Mhm.
So it takes a real concerted effort at study. I would also say, let me show you a diagram I've been working on. It's disabled. Anyway, we need to understand how racism works, as I said, across the board and tackle underlying assumptions based on theory. Even some of our foremost theoreticians have problems about racism. For example, Hyman Jacobs' Ladder, very influential book for Black and Black families. Very prominent scholar, Andrew Billingsley. And his whole notion of Black families are attenuated, torn apart families. And I asked him, why do you say that? He says, because we have to use the Roman Catholic Church's definition of families. Now that is extremely problematic. While I love much of what he's done, that doesn't work for me. Because the very people who tore apart families in Black America then want to define what families are. But you only know that if you study and understand the right questions to ask. And so this whole notion of this kind of drive-by analysis of racism and anti-racist practices doesn't really work. So even at Howard University, I had 2 sets of books. The ones that my instructors gave me and the other set of books that have me understand what was really going on in the world.
Yeah, Mui, I think just to add to that, if sort of thinking about it from a mentor side, and going back to this broader topic of like characteristics or components of anti-racist mentoring, I think this point of like cultural humility is really important, or just humility in general, and understanding that science is dynamic. And so I think being able to practice and model that as mentors to your mentees and trainees is really important, and create space where you can have critical conversations, right? If the goal is to dismantle structural racism, that means that, all of us, we trained, right? We trained within these systems, right? That privilege white supremacy. And so we are likely to make some, we can make those same mistakes, or it can show up in our writing. I think in our writing is one of the key ways actually in which white supremacy shows up in science. And I actually think that we should spend a lot of time talking about that, because even I often sort of see a disconnect in what people say and then what they write. And so I think, modeling that cultural humility, or that humility as a mentor, and being able to create space to have these conversations where people can be really critical. And, obviously, I think through the reading of scholarship and writing of scholarship is one way in which to practice that.
And also, just adding to Kamala's point, writing is the key, and presentation is the key. At the same time, we have to think about who we are missing in terms of having a conversation with. So, we tend to be like narrow, because we are working in academia, we tend to only talk with another faculties, right? Or our students, and their days go by so fast, right? But then I think we need to expand our horizons. We need to talk with the lawmakers, we need to talk with the lawyers, we need to talk with the community organizers, pastors, disseminating our ideas and asking the right questions and listen to what they have to say. Because, most of us are liberal. We tend to just watch the liberal TV, or no, I think we have to follow the other people's, tweeting too, because we have to understand why they are thinking that way, how we can reach out to them to have a conversation on racism. We can't just hang out with our friends, and people who like us, people who have the same ideas, and people who can agree with me. No way. We need to have a tough conversation. We need to reach out to those people who are opposite from us in terms of ideas or principles or anything else. So I think it's so important to open up our heart and be brave and courageous to reach out to the people that we don't know.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah. The conversation about I mean, we have two sets of book, looking at the assumptions, looking at cultural humility, expanding our own horizon, I mean, really thankful for the conversation and the dialogue, and the thoughts from all of, our panelists. Yeah. Daniel.
Very much. And the last points around those dialogues to have, it's an excellent transition to the wrap up where what we would ask panelists to be able to reflect on at the end for about 2 to 3 minutes, were your best hopes for the future to promote mentorship that supports anti-racist and inclusive research, as well as really the essential next steps for mentees, faculty, institutions, as we think from transitioning from a dialogue into next steps for action. And I think we can go, sorry, with the order that we had at the beginning. So Dr. Spencer, if you start.
Well, what sort of jumps out to me is this idea of inclusion and exclusion. I think that a lot of, both big P's and little P's and everything else, I think, sort of has a common theme of exclusion. There's a sense of somehow not being a part of a system or not fitting well into a system. But I also think the other side of it, the part of inclusion, I think a lot of, especially for people like myself, come from a Native background, that the invisibility and the erasure of our history and our experience from social work and from the problems that we sort of face within social work are make it almost impossible to even address an issue sometimes, because it's not even seen, and so thinking about not just sort of how folks are excluded, but, how are we included and if we're included at all, I think in terms of centering whiteness, from our institutions, part of how I do that is just bringing my own self into that conversation. And I think that, it's such a basic place to start, but if people don't even see you or know you or understand you or know your history, then it's hard to even describe, what it is we're trying to achieve. So, just try to keep my final words simple. And that is, let's, as we think about anti-racism, let's not only think about how we've been excluded, but also how, our histories have been erased and have been made invisible within our own profession.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Jones.
Michael, that was pretty powerful. I'm thinking, I was thinking as you were talking, I think much of what you said applies to my own race, having been stripped of so much of who we are, what we bring to the process, is so damaging that sometimes for me it's kind of challenging for me to even know how to respond, actually. And I think probably as an academic, I've been at an institution where I felt that. I almost felt like I was invisible. I didn't matter. What I thought or said didn't matter. And it was like, I had essentially been hired to fulfill the diversity standard based on, because back when I came about, CSWE, when they did site visits for accreditation, if you didn't have any Black faculty, then you'd have like so many however long to get some and whatever. So myself and several of us were hired for that reason. We didn't know it when we were hired, but when we got there, it became abundantly clear that that's why we were hired. And so it does make it challenging to have to think about how do you transform a system like that. And I will share openly at the time, I really didn't know. I was new to academia, and the only thing I knew is I had to get out. I knew I needed to get out. that I knew. I didn't know how to transform anything. I just knew that wasn't the right place for me, and that's how I had to do something different. So I made a change, and it was a good change for me. Perfect, no, but a much better change than the one I had come from. And it was in that second position that I really started to think differently in terms of these structures in place and how to have my voice be heard, or how to make some impact. And I had some white colleagues at that other school that supported it and worked with me. So sometimes we have to align ourselves with people not just that only look like us, but people who share the same passion and beliefs about how things should be and how people should be treated, and how structures should be dismantled. So I think you just kind of have to find that for yourself, and recognize it may not always be that person that looks like you that can help make that change, but it's someone that thinks like you and believe in the same things that you believe in, who can help you get past some of this or get through some of this. Because it's daunting, people. It is very daunting to be at an institution where no one looks like you, or if someone there does look like you, they've been totally whitewashed, and you all are in very totally different head spaces. And so it becomes a challenge. So I think you have to think about those things, look for those people that you can align yourself with that can help you make change that's going to be better for you, them, and the institution in the long run.
Thank you, Dr. Hong.
Yes, my advice is that, so final advice, I think it's important for us to celebrate the small success, because as Dr. Jones said, it's rough, it's long, it's tough, daunting. It's a daunting road. So it's easily like exhausted or burnout, right? But really, because of that, it's so important for us to nourish our mind and our soul. Whatever you do, self-care or celebrating, just with the little things, with your colleague or your friends, family, just taking care of yourself is going to be so critical. And at the same time, we have to be ready, and we have to truly believe that life is difficult. Life is difficult, but only way that we can, one of the only ways that we can succeed is be disciplined. We need to be disciplined to call out the racist action or policies, with creating your allies. You do it together. We need to fight micro or macro in that way, and we'll get there. Let's be hopeful.
Dr. Alcantara.
Thanks again, for organizing this panel. I really appreciate what's been shared, shared already. And I think I have one thought about advice and one thought about hope. And I think that advice, that remembering that this is a long game, and the charge is to take this lens and approach into, whatever you do next as well. I know we have a range of people who are here, but you don't need to be in an administrative position to make a change. You can make change as a student, you can make change as a junior faculty member, as a senior faculty member, and the burden should not be distributed equally. which I think that would be, you know, for another panel, and that I think our white identified colleagues could, you know, shoulder more of the burden in light of the structural racism issues that we mentioned. And then I think sort of the hope that I would have is that I think institutions really own mentorship. I think that there's so little that is resources from an institutional level that's placed on mentoring and learning how to teach faculty mentors to mentor, and, you know, teaching doctoral students to be effective mentors. And I think that there's like almost like a disinvestment in it, and everyone sort of just figures it out and cobbles it together. But I think my hope would be that that institutions really see the benefit and the long-term benefit in investing in teaching about mentoring and teaching about anti-racist mentoring and inclusive mentorship. But I think we're far from that. This is a great, I think, initiative, and we can learn from each other. But, you know, sort of bringing this back to have that long-term systemic change at our respective institutions, I think is going to require some more advocacy.
Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Teasley?
You know, I just wanted to place a lot of emphasis on understanding the centrality of race and having an in-depth study. And don't put all your eggs in one basket in terms of mentorship. I have several mentors for several different things and calling on people for lots of things. You should do that also. I really agree with what all that's been said. Don't try to change everything in one day. We're in a tough time right now. Freedom is being challenged, and we need to speak truth to power. As I've always say, freedom is never free. Each generation must earn it, and that's why it's so precious. And so as Malcolm X said, what will you do for your freedom? He said, if you want to know what I'll do for my freedom, ask what you would do for yours, and then double it. What you work, in terms of the centrality of racism, I want to just show you a chart that I'm working on for a book chapter. Can you see that there? So here we have the micro, meso, and macro levels. And here are individual practices, broader community practices, and institutional practices that are problematized by race and racism. And so we need to study all of these different things because they undergird many of the problems that we are seeing in people. And so, you know, the whole notion of the social determinants of health, then the social determinants of racism should be high on our list. And we do that in an era where the country is moving, and I hope we can stop it from becoming fascist. Just stop right there. Don't want to leave you on a bad note. There's lots of hope. But as Paul said, a battlefront is everywhere. There's no shelter for the student, the professor. We're all in this for something better than ourselves.
But Tia, your list is very impressive. It's actually very helpful because it set things so clear. You know, what should be the steps? Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, so thank you to our esteemed panel for this important discussion. Thank you to everyone that's part of the webinar for engaging in it. I think the panelists summed up all of the key central themes as well as ideas going forward, but a couple that really just struck me were around that importance of being proactive and that collective shared responsibility, the focus on promoting mentorship that is focused on promoting anti-racist and inclusive research is about more than diversity, equity, inclusion. It's about dismantling systems and structures and systemic racism. And also that I think as was summed up, that it's not change that's going to happen in one meeting or in one program, that there is, as Dr. Alcantara said, a long game. And so kind of in that spirit, I think we hope that this webinar is part of one step in that long game. organizing, motivating step that helps us deepen our thinking and think about collective and shared next steps in terms of our responsibility. As part of that, I wanted to highlight that SSWR is holding more discussions along these lines on May 24th. There's another webinar for focus on strategies for supporting anti-racist pedagogy and scholarship, reimagining institutional systems and structures. And so I thank you all for joining us all together in this really important endeavor to take us closer to steps towards systemic change, both within our field as well as society more broadly.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.